what does it mean to fully process an emotion? For example, something that pops up and reminds me of something from the past, and that's why it's triggering me. How do we process the initial trauma so that if it feels like we just keep returning to that same old pattern? This is a great question. This is a little bit of like the question to doing this mind-body healing work. And it's a question I get a lot from a lot of people about how do I know when the thing has been processed? So, I mean, the simple answer is the way that we process the emotional content from those traumatic experiences is through things like JournalSpeak. Journaling and writing it out, finding a way to express how you are feeling about that story or that experience now, as well as how you were feeling back then or how you weren't safe to feel back then, is really the key, because that's kind of the whole problem. We shove things down, we learn to repress and suppress our emotional experiences, and they come back up through the body later. So our job really is to just find a way to express those things, to move them through and out of our mind-body system. So what I usually recommend for people in terms of kind of zeroing in on JournalSpeak as a significant tool is that you make sure to journal about and express yourself around the initial trauma, if you know what it is in as many angles as possible. And what I mean by that is sometimes, if something bad happened when we were a kid, like something that was really scary, then we might automatically assume that the feeling we need to work through in response to that initial trauma is fear, which makes sense and would be good to do. But there's also very much possibility that there's also disappointment in there. There's also anger in there, frustration, confusion. There could be a sense of betrayal between you and the person who was involved in that story or who didn't get involved in that story with you. So it's really useful to make sure that we're looking from all the emotional angles that we can about any old event, and make sure we're giving ourselves room to feel more than one thing about an event. I also often recommend that people write about it from different perspectives. So writing about it from your present moment perspective, your adult self looking back on that past event and writing about how it feels for you now, but also writing about that event from that age you's perspective. So letting, if it was actually in childhood, letting that inner child come forward and speak up for all the things they didn't get to say or feel at that time. And also it can be really helpful, especially for those of us who struggle to get in touch with emotion, to really feel the feelings. Sometimes it's really useful to write about the story from a third person's perspective. So, and I think Nicole talks about this too, and she calls it reporter style writing. So you write, this is the story about Caroline. She's 6 years old and she lives in this town and she's got, these family members living with her. And one day she goes to school and, someone just really lays into her, total bully, fiasco. And just kind of like getting into the story from that third person perspective sometimes really helps us to get in touch with the emotions, because we've learned how to disconnect from our own emotional experience. But we often have this really strong empathy that we are able to feel for others. So using that third person voice can help us get in touch that way. It can also be helpful, a little bit strange, but helpful to write from the perspective of someone else who was present. So if there was a family member or a friend or teacher, someone around at that time, kind of writing from their perspective about that version of you and that story of what happened. Very similar to the previous example, it just can sometimes really help us to get into a more objective perspective of the emotionality of that experience and how someone else might have looked at it if it's a little too tough to look at it directly ourselves. So that's my number one tip, is to look at things from as many angles as possible and as many emotional, kind of avenues as possible as well. And then when it comes time to ask the question of how do I know when I have processed the trauma or the trigger itself, the answer really is in your experience of the triggering. So if you've got a pattern around, a challenging relationship with your sister, and up until now, every time the phone rings and you see her name come up on the caller ID, you just wow, go into tremors and fits. You'll know that you still have stuff lingering around that pattern, around that relationship, and whatever it means to you. So you will want to go back and keep writing about that, particularly the past stuff, but also how it's coming up for you now. And when you've done enough of that processing and expression, you'll start to notice that you behave differently in response to those same triggers. And you'll be more able to have in that example, a conversation with your sister about today without, lugging along this weight of all this past stuff that had never been addressed before.